want to take you, we've got a lot to cover tonight. So my heart is to get us out of the Old Testament and into the New. Here's what we've, at least in a nutshell. We have landed that the providence of God is not just emotional. It's not just God being mad and angry at humans and using animals to punish humans or the earth to punish humans, storms and all, but that it's always been about a plan. Genesis 3:15, God has been working a plan the whole time. Nothing has caught Him by surprise, and God is working that. We called it the offspring timeline, because from Genesis 3:15 until the birth of Christ and then the return of Christ, God is working a plan. He's not caught off guard, and whatever plan God is working, humans become involved in that. So the Old Testament has been, how does God work with humans? How does God work with creation? That we said last week, we kind of brought it to rogue creation. And in our class, we were talking about that, and I kind of redefined it because I thought that might be a better thought, that it kind of more is an unpredictable. Creation is now unpredictable. You can have storms, you can have rain, you can have fire, you can have earthquakes and the things that go on. But in that, how does God work with this creation that's bound in unbelief or sin, we would say, bound by the curse because of Adam and Eve, but something profound, and this is where we're going to deposit the plane tonight, something profoundly changes when we come into the New Testament and Christ dies and He's resurrected, and the real question is going to be, how does the providence of God work now? Does He still use creation? How does He still punish, if He does punish at all, when we get to Christ? So we're going to take you there in the next 2 weeks. And then round 2 is that we're going to talk about that in depth. So I think you will be challenged. You'll grow a lot to see the providence of God, because now in part 2, His providence is going to be, see, what role do you play? What role do I play as His kids? Are we included in it? And we'll go there. Let's jump into a thought we had. We ended here last week, but we'll look at it again. It appears that the original intent of creation went rogue. Again, I'll give a definition that just means unpredictable, and rest awaits in the future. And we said this, for through Him, God created everything, talking about Jesus, everything in the heavenly realms and the earth, the things we can see and the things we cannot see. And we left this, that God is not just working in the stuff you can see. So when we look at the unseen world, we're talking about spirits, we're talking about demons, we're talking about gods, we're talking about the seen world, so that means people, animals, creation, whatever it may be. And we left you here last week, all things created, seen and unseen, will intertwine with God's providential plan. So as you talk about the providence of God, you'll see creation, you'll see trees, animals, nature, all involved, but you'll also see humans and spirit beings involved, angels, demons, gods, the things that we would look at in the other world, all of those will be involved. The most interesting thing is when Christ does come, here's what I'm so excited about. When Christ does come, every one of those things begin to bump into Him. The creation begins to bump into Him. The donkey bumps into Him. The water turning into wine, the storm on the lake, the demon that meets Him. Everything begins to bump into this Creator. Humans begin to bump into Him. So again, if you want to, my thinking is, if you look at the providence of God from the Old Testament, we must be careful, because once we come to the New Testament, the Creator, who is the one that is providential, becomes God in the flesh. And so then therefore you see how creation starts responding with His authority. And so I think it's going to be very interesting as we pull it out. Listen to Ephesians 3, verse 9. I was chosen to explain to everyone the mysterious plan that God the Creator kept secret from the beginning. God's purpose in all this was that the church, this is what we've been saying so far, would display His wisdom, rich in variety to all the unseen rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms, and this has been His eternal plan, which He carried out through Christ Jesus. In other words, I've said it before, but it bears mentioning again. Nothing happening is by chance. Everything happening was a plan that was started at the beginning. It was mysterious until we come to Jesus. That mysterious plan was the display of God's wisdom, as would be seen in His people to the church, but it wouldn't just be seen to you and I. We would be on display for the unseen realm. In other words, today, your life and my life are on display for the world to see. And it's amazing, this is my thinking, it's amazing to me how many Christians are afraid of devils when we display the wisdom of God to those devils of the authority that we have. And so we walk in a different authority, but many people today who claim Christ still live with an Old Testament perspective of that. We'll talk about that in part 2. This was the eternal plan through Jesus. The reasoning of God's providential involvement in creation is to display His wisdom. If we are going to talk about providence and how the sovereignty of God works with us, we must know that what His goal is that humans would see His wisdom. And this has been the problem from the beginning of time, because before there were hurricanes, before there were tornadoes or beasts of burden that could cause problems, or diseases, or locusts, or frogs, or flies, or whatever we would want to pick out of the Old Testament as going, that seems to be God doing something with nature. What we can say, before there was anything done with nature, Adam and Eve had to come to reconcile themselves to His wisdom. And His wisdom was not because of a tornado. His wisdom was just His Word. And He says, do not eat that tree. Now in that moment, the providence of God is seen greater than ever before, because the wisdom of God, do not eat that tree or you die, becomes His providential plan, do not eat the tree. And then they eat the tree. In other words, they snub their nose at His wisdom. So as we've said before in some of our other classes, the battle the whole time has been for the wisdom of God. So you cannot talk providential power of God apart from wisdom. So even before there was a tornado to, quote, get people's attention or punish people, there was just His Word. And His Word was His providential will. Do not eat that tree or you die. So wisdom, right at the very beginning. Now here's the issue. What happens when they eat? They die. What is the providential wisdom of God? The providential wisdom is not all the stuff He does with creation, how He manipulates or controls, I won't use manipulate, but how He can control creation to get things done. You have to go to the base of God's providential power is His Word. And when man snubbed his nose at His Word, everything goes rogue, in other words, unpredictable. Man becomes in a sinful, cursed state. And so now watch. How is God going to remedy this? Christ, which is the Word, in flesh, which is also the wisdom and the power of God. So He's going to send His Word again. He sends His Word the first time, we snub our nose at it, and then all this hell begins to ensue with creation and animals and diseases and death. And then He says, well, here's what we're going to do again. I'm going to send the Word again. And the Word becomes flesh. And that Word become flesh is the wisdom of God. It's why Jesus will say, you must eat my flesh, you must drink my blood. We're right back to the same thing. Well, so when you talk providence, don't think God's mad only and He's only emotional. Every time you think providence, we need to be reading through it and go, there's something in this that's the wisdom of God. So when you read about Jonah, when you read about Pharaoh, when you read about all of the different places in the Bible where this displays itself, the greatest thing to do is to dive in and go, what about this story shows me God's wisdom? What about this thing caused me to see something in a way that I normally would not see it? And that's what we said last week. Ultimately, that's Christ in the Old Testament becoming the wisdom of God. 1 Corinthians 1. But to those who are called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power and the wisdom of God. So when God says, you can eat this tree, but you cannot eat that tree because that's my wisdom, in that moment of good and evil, and in that moment of life, we could say that there sits the wisdom of God. In both trees are good. Be careful how you look at it, because you'll take the tree of knowledge of good and evil as to be an evil, wicked little tree, because that's kind of the way we pursue it. That tree was just as good as this tree. Both of them were made by God. Both of them were called good by God. Both of them had God's DNA of His Word in it. But the thing that separated the two trees was nothing but wisdom. So the wisdom of God sat in the middle of these two trees, good and evil, and the knowledge thereof, and life. And so what God is going to do, my thinking and my belief is that Christ was represented in those two trees, which is why He'll ultimately hang on a tree. He is both the wisdom of God, He is both the one that will determine the righteousness of God, and He's also the life of God. So as it plays out, here's what happens though. It says that's a foolish plan. 1 Corinthians 1:25, the foolish plan of God is wiser than the human plans. So if we try to understand the providence of God, anytime a human in our humanity tries to understand God, it's just going to feel foolish. God's wisdom always feels foolish to us. The foolishness of give and it'll be given back. No, that's foolish. You can't give because giving is losing, not getting. Love your enemies, foolish. Bless those that curse you, foolish. So in our own thinking, if we're not careful, what happens is we start seeing things happen in creation, and then we as humans try to juggle, well, was that a good thing or was that a bad thing? Because we've been doing that since the day we ate the fruit. Because the moment we bit the tree of knowledge of good and evil, guess who becomes in charge of what's good and evil? We do. So that's why we can say God's awful, God's a bad God, God's a baby killer, because now we're in charge of the knowledge of good and evil. We're the ones that define what is good. We're the ones that define what is evil. This is why Jesus will say, in your own eyes, you feel like you're righteous. In your own thinking, you're godly. It's why the Pharisees could think, I have towed the line here, I'm more righteous than anybody, and Jesus will say, well, good, you're the son of the devil. You're a rotten grave. So the reality of what's going on, and this is why it's so difficult to explain the providence of God, because we're trying to explain His providence from we ate the fruit. So I will determine what's good and what's bad. So even when you read the Bible, we can read the Bible with, whew, oh man, that was bad. That was awful. But when you read the Bible, even though that bad things are happening, there's death, there's sickness, there's diseases, there's all the things that are part of the curse. As I'm reading through the bad things of the Bible, I have to tell myself that under the core of that is the goodness of God. The good and the bad that's happening is because we humans have gotten in charge and we're trying to navigate how to do life outside of His wisdom. So when a tornado comes, we try to go, well, that's bad because it killed this many people. And it's not that God's up there going, well, the tornado's really good. And we're going, no, the tornado's bad. It's that you and I now are in control of what is good and what is bad and what is right and what is wrong. So God is having to navigate His character while we're the judge of who He is. We judge Him to be good or bad. So we become the judge now. So it's very difficult as a human to try to determine, and I've said this previously, it's very difficult to determine in the moment if what I'm going through is good or bad. Because the way I'm going to do it is, if it's going bad, then it's bad. Well, what is bad? It's not going my way. I threw my hip out. I got a snotty nose. My kid's not feeling well. I'm probably going to lose my job. God, this is bad. And true, I would agree with you. That all sounds bad. But from the other side of the perspective is, He works all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purposes. So the reality of the providence of God is just stay with His purpose. And the end result is, I don't really care what it looks like right now. The end result of His purpose is, it will turn out good for me. So I do have to be careful that I don't judge good and bad. And I gave that example of my wife, Monica, that died. Very bad thing. Judged it as bad. Awful thing. But 30 years, 35 looking back over it, if you said, we'll go back and fix all that and give it all back to you, but you got to let Robin go, you got to let your girls go, you got to let your grandkids go, because all of that came out of that tragedy. I would say, are you nuts? How could I do that? So as a human, to understand the providence of God, be careful that you define His providence in an hour of your life or a week of your life or even a decade of your life, because the God you're trying to define within your 10-year scope is eternal. And He's so far ahead of you. He's so far outside of your scope. So that's why we would need to stay with Him. Well, here's where it gets interesting. At every juncture where the providence of God meets humanity, because that is the truth. The providence of God really was not at first, this issue that God had with animals. The animals didn't disobey. The trees did not disobey. The birds, the fish did not disobey. His real run-in with His providence was humans. And because humans disobeyed, everything now becomes affected, and then therefore everything becomes subject to the fall of humans. And so this is it. At every juncture where the providence of God meets humanity, what we're going to find, this is, again, my opinion, but I like it. In every story that you read in the Bible, you will find His wisdom nestled into the story and His power nestled into the story. Be careful, I've said this a lot, be careful that you make the Bible about the characters of the Bible. The characters of the Bible are given to us whereby we may know God better. David is not in the Bible so you know David better. Because what good would it do you to know David any better? Really nothing, except, wow, he inspires me. I wish I could do that. So my belief is the stories are good, but the real thing that changes me is every story of the Bible is to say this: that story is either a story for God's wisdom or against it. So I can determine the character of the story, David and Bathsheba. I can do David and Absalom. I can pick anybody I want to. I can pick Solomon. But when I pick a human being, whatever story is developing in that story, I will guarantee you will find either they obeyed God's wisdom or they disobeyed His wisdom. Now, once I determine that, then I can just see, well, once they obey or disobey, I should be able to see the resulting power out of that choice. So if you disobey God's wisdom, frogs come and get you. Right? The story of Pharaoh. If you obey God's wisdom, nothing touches the land of Goshen. So that all I would love to do is I read the story, which is brilliant, why you can read 1 minute that there has never been a human like Solomon, the most wise, incredible, and I read that and I go, Solomon, he asked God for wisdom. Oh, and God blessed him so much. He had so much money. Just God asked him for wisdom. That's the story. Solomon asked God for wisdom. God gave him more than wisdom, gave him everything. But if you read the brother's life, he obviously didn't ask God for wisdom every day. Because he ends up with 700 and something women. And by the end of his life, it says these women led him astray. So I just need to know that I have to be very gentle with the providence of God and judging God. I need to start here. Providence of God, a human story, there's wisdom in this story. Did they reject it or receive it? And then power is going to show up. And anywhere you have wisdom and power, you have Christ being revealed. So what in this story is going to show me something about Christ? All right, and that's my belief. I didn't come up with this. I think it was Oral Roberts that came up with Christ in every book of the Bible. In Genesis, He's. In Exodus, He's. Go Google it. Jesus in every book of the Bible. It's so inspiring that the Bible's just not randomly put together. The Bible is written so that every book of the Bible shows you a nature of God, and every book and every story shows you the character of God, and Jesus Christ is in every book of the Bible to display the wisdom of God. And again, I won't belabor the point. But if we're not careful, I make the Bible about Samson and Delilah and all the people, right? They're great stories, but just remember, every story is to lead you to wisdom and power. Listen to Corinthians verse 26, chapter 1. Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were not wise in the world's eyes, or powerful or wealthy when God calls you, but God chose the things of the world that He considers foolish in order to shame those who think they're wise. And He chose things that are powerless to shame those who think they're powerful. And God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and He used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, nobody can ever boast in the presence of God. In other words, it's almost like He takes you back to the Garden of Eden and says, look, before you guys ate the tree, everything was good. And then you ate the tree, and the moment you ate the tree, the things that you consider so wise, I consider foolish. And the things you consider so strong, I consider powerless. And the things that you despise and you count as wonderful, I count them as nothing at all. So God in this one verse is showing what happens when a human eats the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we think we're brilliant. And we think we get to define what is right, what is good, what is powerful. And this verse shows up and says, no, what's happening is the result is humans try to now boast apart from the presence of God. So the moment Eve takes the fruit and bites and Adam bites, it's their way to say, we're going to boast of ourselves. Here's the thought. This is where it gets really interesting. At every juncture where providence of God meets humanity, we will find the result is the exposure of human pride. This is my thinking. Every time we see something providential happening, whether, let's take Korah, the rebellion of Korah with Moses. And they draw straws and they bring out Korah's family. And then just lo and behold, the earth just goes and just eats him. Eats the whole family. Just because of a rebellion of Korah. The reality of that is, I can look at that and say, that is so awful. That is a bad thing. God caused the earth to open up and eat a dude. But I have to start with that any time, because of the beginning of humanity, any time the providence of God shows up, all God is going to do is show you the power of human pride. In every story. He sleeps with Bathsheba, and Nathan shows up, and we see the resulting of David's human pride. God, chapter 1 of Corinthians, verse 30 now, God has united you with Christ Jesus. For our benefit, God made Jesus wisdom. Christ made us right with God. He made us pure and holy, and He freed us from sin. Now, at every juncture of providence, when God meets humanity, we'll find an opportunity to be made right with God. So what's happening is every time providence meets up with God, or humans, God's providence meets up with a human, what we begin to see is God's going to deal with human pride, God is going to deal with making man right, and God is going to deal with His wisdom. So His providence is going to be a display of wisdom that will expose human pride, that will show an opportunity to be made right with Him. You would think that every human would go, I want to be right with God. But His providence shows us that when His wisdom shows up, Pharaoh, let my people go. No, human pride shows up. And when human pride shows up, you realize Pharaoh never has a desire to be made right with God. But God's providence always offers that opportunity. He always puts the opportunity in front of you. So watch this play out again with Pharaoh. There is the providence of God with humanity is the display of wisdom. Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh says, no, I'm not letting people go because of pride. Therefore, the moment the wisdom, remember this teaching, when the wisdom of God came and Pharaoh rejected it, his heart was hardened. So the Bible says, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. The way He hardened Pharaoh's heart is, here's my wisdom. I reject your wisdom, then your heart is hard. That means I have pride, and when I have pride, I will not be made right with God. And that is the entire Old Testament. The entire Old Testament is God working through creation and working through humans to display wisdom, to show human pride, that in human pride, no human can ever be made right with God. It is impossible. The whole of the Old Testament is, it is impossible to be made right with God because human pride will never own up to His wisdom. He tells me to bring a spotless lamb, I bring a cheap one. I'm going to cheat Him however I can cheat Him. That's what's in us. This is why when Christ comes as a human, it's so powerful because no other human is going to do what He's going to do. So follow this, because this is where we're going in part 2. His wisdom shows up to Adam. Adam says, thank you, but no. His heart is hardened with pride, and now he's not right with God. All of humanity born through him is now born in pride, born rejecting the wisdom of God, and born not right with God. The entire Old Testament is to prove a point. You humans always reject my wisdom because you're prideful and you're not right with me. Now, to keep from killing all of you, I'm going to go ahead and establish my plan. And my plan is there's going to have to be mercy, justice, and punishment. And the way we're going to do it is with blood. And this whole elaborate system of the Old Testament is set up for nothing more than the wisdom of God to be on display, for the power of God to be on display, to show the pride of humanity, so that we can ultimately say there's no way to be right with God. That's why only once a year a guy could go in this curtain and dump all this blood over everything. So powerful that was that he had to tie a rope to him in case he died, they could drag him out. Because of this whole concept of providence of God. But the whole time that God is doing that, God's like, this is okay. I just need them to know there's no way they can accomplish this. Well, how many of you know when God says there's no way you can accomplish my will? Oh, yes, we can. Get out of our way and watch. So God gives them 10 rules. We give God 600 more back. And then we're very happy and content. And by the time God shows up to humans, we are so prideful that a human calls God the devil. That's how prideful they were. This ought to make sense now when Paul says, everything I've ever done is nothing but dung compared to knowing Christ. That's because he was wrestling with that. He was wrestling with, I kept all the rules. I did everything just like it did. But then he says this, but woe is me. I just can't do it. It's impossible for me to pull this off. It's impossible. Everything I once counted as something is nothing. So providence of God is working His wisdom. His providence is working about pride. And His providence is working to make people right. That's what He's doing. It goes on to say this, verse 31 of 1 Corinthians 1. Therefore the Scriptures say, if you want to boast, guess who you can boast in? Only God. And then this final thought. At every juncture where providence of God meets humanity, you will find there's only one way. If you read the Bible, I'm not saying it's every case. There's a few that don't follow the plan. Most stories in the Bible, God offers His wisdom, and then there is one way. This is the way, walk this way. Do this thing. So that God in the Old Testament is establishing a pattern that there is His way, which is the only way. All right, so let's put it together. The providence of God has to do with the display of His wisdom. He makes His will known. When He makes His will known, it will determine the human heart, whether that human is prideful or not prideful or humble. When the human responds to God, there comes the display of power, even in mercy or grace or punishment. Either or, it's His justice. So once a human responds, justice is meted out. When justice is meted out, you will then know whether the human is right with God or wrong with God. And the moment you determine right or wrong, you will say the only way to be made right with God is there's only one way. This story will make most sense when Uzzah simply reaches out his hand and tries to help God. The story is that they're taking the ark of God from one location to another on a cart full of oxen. Again, their own wisdom. God said, carry it on poles. We're like, too hot, too heavy. We'll put it on a cart and let oxen carry it. Right? Too hot. I don't have the poles. I can't do it. They put it on a cart, their own wisdom. They put it on the cart and they're walking it, and all of a sudden the oxen stumble and the cart shakes, and Uzzah, with good intention, well-meaning, is now going to help God out. With his own wisdom, in his own pride, and his own way, he is going to do what he thinks is right. So he reaches his hands out, steadies the ark, you're welcome, God, and drops dead, which is a crazy thing. He drops dead. And when he drops dead, the reality is, if I'm reading that as a human, I think, well, that's terrible. I can't believe God had killed the brother. He's trying to help God out. And then I would even, if I were reading it, I would go, I don't want to serve that kind of God. A God that I'm trying to help him and he kills me. That's not even the kind of God that I want to be a part of. Again, think this through, just to watch. Moses sells his soul to God, spends 40 years out here in the desert keeping sheep, then spends 40 more years wandering around with a motley crew of people who can't ever do anything right but whine. He is doing it because God gave him a vision and a promise. Take my people to this promised land. And Moses toes the line. Moses is just like, God, if you're going to kill them, kill me. I'm going to intercede for these people. And then he gets out there, and on a Saturday, I guess, he had a rough one. He woke up on the wrong side of the bed. God said, strike the rock. And he just decides, I'm a little ticked. I deserve to be mad because these people have really gotten on my nerves today. Smack, smack. Just. And God's like, nope, not going in. Not going in. I'm like, all he did was just smacked it twice. Come on, God. Hook a brother up. Who wants to serve a God that if I just trip up, I'm going to lose everything? But by the time you come to the New Testament, you realize that rock was Christ. That rock was God's wisdom. And Moses snubbed his nose at wisdom. What happens when a human snubs his nose at wisdom? The human heart is revealed. And it's pride. And when the human heart is revealed in pride, what happens to the prideful heart? You suddenly realize that the prideful heart is going to meet the power of God. And when Moses, with a prideful heart, meets the power of God, justice is meted out, and God says, you're not going in because now you're not right with me. That's the beauty of the story. Because Moses, there's only one way, buddy, and it's listen to what I tell you. Amen. And I'm not here to take your opinion. You do it my way. Yeah. Which sounds awful. Sounds like a dictator telling me what to do. I want to do my own thing. Now, the beauty of this is when we come to the New Testament, you're going to see the providence of God from the Old Testament play out in the New Testament. Why? Because the brother Moses is coming back on the Mount of Transfiguration. And he's going to show up over here. We're going to talk about him. He's going to show up in the providence of God, and we'll see why he got. But here it is. The providence of God is his wisdom, his on display, the heart revealed that will confront his power, that will be made right or wrong with him, and there's only one way. Those 5 things. Now, those 5 things are going to be a perfect definition of Jesus Christ. Listen to this thought. This is a question. What is the only way for human pride to be made right with God? What's the only way that human pride could be made right with God? Well, the base answer would be, if I was throwing answers to you, I'd say, well, the only way to be made right with human pride with God is I'd have to go back to how we got wrong with pride, and it was a rejection of wisdom. So how can a human be made right with God? I would have to say that human therefore would have to receive his wisdom instead of reject it. So we come to this verse, Philippians 2:6. Though he was God, speaking of Jesus, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, here it comes, he gave up his divine privileges. He humbled himself as a slave and was born as a human being. And when he appeared in human form, I'm going to go ahead and finish reading it. The humbling of Jesus in his divine position to become a slave as to human bondage. That is the answer. The question was, what is the only way for human pride to be made right with God? And the answer is the humbling of Jesus, human pride. He humbled himself as a human in his divine position to become a slave. It goes on to say, verse 8, he humbled himself in obedience to God, and he died a criminal's death. It all starts playing out in the life of Jesus. If you ever get ticked about the providence of God, remember what I said last week. You need to roll yourself all the way to the New Testament. Because Christ will become the wisdom of God. Christ is the power of God. And the human God that became human, who is Christ the power and Christ the wisdom, steps in as a human and says, okay, I can either be in pride or I can be humble. So I'm going to humble myself. Well, when I humble myself, guess what has to happen? I have to submit myself. Remember, wisdom causes the heart to be exposed in pride. Once the heart responds, we see the justice of God meted out in power. So Jesus steps in as wisdom and power and says, okay, I totally lay it down. And what I'm going to do is humble myself, but I'm going to humble myself to die. In other words, I humble myself to your power. I humble myself to the justice and the punishment. So he's going to humble his own self. He's now going to take the punishment and die a criminal's death. So remember, the equation for divine providence is mercy plus obedience plus justice. The mercy of God comes and said, here's my wisdom. You can obey it or not. And when you obey it or not, justice will be meted out. And when justice is meted out, we would call that the glory of God. Now in mercy, Pharaoh let my people go. He says no. He disobeys. There's the hardness of heart. Justice comes in, and the glory of God is on display. As we walk through that, we will see that Jesus comes. Jesus is the grace and mercy of God. John chapter 1 came to humans. Jesus fulfilled perfectly in his humility obedience, and in his obedience fulfilled the justice because he took punishment, and now Christ in you is the hope of God's glory. So again, let's don't get mad at what God did in the Old Testament, because it's going to be done to himself. The mercy is God becomes a human. The obedience is God humbles himself. The justice is God dies a criminal's death. So all of these things of the Old Testament, when he's showing forth his power and his glory, we now see that God himself is going to become a human, and that's merciful. He's going to do what we cannot do. There has never been a human yet that can do it because of pride. We always scramble to be on top and to save self. That's why when they yell at him on the cross, save yourself, it becomes such a wonderful thing that he stays obedient and humbles himself. And in his justice is that he dies a criminal's death. He's punished. He was innocent, but he still had to pay the price. And then God's glory is that Christ lives in us. It's the hope of glory. So that the divine providence of God should never be tried to define it outside the work of Christ. If not, you'll make it only about humans. It's not about humans. It's always been about Christ. Humans just show up to show that you're disobedient, you never choose my wisdom, you're prideful, and you always disobey, and you hit my justice, and when you hit my justice, the end result is you're never right with me. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a human and do it perfectly, so that I, end result, can make you right with me. So if I look at this here, what is the end result of God's glory? Let's go back to what I've said in the other slides. The end result of His glory is Christ is in me, which is the hope of glory. Well, what is the hope of glory? I have been made right with God, right? I've been now made right with God because of Christ in me. I'm now right with God. Well, if I'm right with God, that therefore means that the justice must have been meted, but not on me, but on Christ in me. And then if Christ is in me, it must not be because of a prideful heart, but because I was humbled, and I humbled myself and said, God, I need you. I cannot do this on my own. And the reason I cannot do this on my own, because there's only one way, and that is your wisdom. And your wisdom said there's only one way, and the one way is Christ. And Christ is the justice, and He's the punishment, and He's the mercy, and He's the obedience, and He's the right standing with God, and He's the humility, and He's the glory. So therefore, when the Bible says Christ is the only way to be saved, it's not God being mean, it's Him being factual. It's a fact. So I understand it sounds so narrow-minded from an outside viewpoint. He's the only way. As Oprah said, there's many ways to God. And I say, absolutely. There's thousands of ways to God. But when you get up there, you won't be right. So there's a lot of ways to get to Him. But once you get up there and stand in front of Him, it will be pride. It will be, I chose my own wisdom. I thought my own way. I was right in my own eyes because I determined what's good and evil, and I determined myself to be good. And then therefore my way was, I was good, I was right, I was humble, I worked hard, I was kind to people, I was better than my neighbor. And I stand before you and go, here I am, take all of me. And He goes, I don't even know you. And I go, that just feels so awful. But the whole reasoning is of the Old Testament is to bring you to a place you cannot do this. So as we get to the New Testament, what you're going to see is a huge difference between how Jews approach Jesus and how Gentiles approach Him. Jews approach Him very much, we can work this out. We can obey all these rules and do all these things. We cannot eat meat. We cannot sacrifice blood. And then by the time Paul goes, I'm done with y'all. Oh my God, y'all are just, I can't go to you Jews anymore. I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And then he starts going to the Gentiles. You start seeing everything changes of how he ministers to this group of people. Because he said, I used to come in demonstration of wisdom. And no, now I come in power. I used to try to come at you and give you all these reasons why. You'll see him as he's debating on Mars Hill. Well, this God is that, and this God is this. And then finally he just goes, look, I'm just going to have to come to you in power. Because it's how humans start viewing the providence of God, and it does become a mess. Go out there and try to say to a religious person, Jesus Christ is the only way, and there's nothing you need to do about it. And if you died today after serving Him 80 years, you're no better than a person that got born again 5 minutes before he died. It can freak a religious person out. But when you go over here and tell the crack addict, God loves you, and all of a sudden he's just on fire. So even humans to this day are trying to navigate this person called Christ and how the providence of God is all in the person of Christ. Philippians 2. Therefore, said of Jesus, God elevated Him to the place of honor and gave Jesus a name above all other names, that at the name of Jesus every knee, here we come, every knee in heaven and on the earth and under the earth, there's all those realms again, every knee has to bow to Him, and every tongue has to declare that He's Lord to the glory of the Father. Now this is powerful, because what we're going to learn in the New Testament is that God doesn't need to use creation anymore, because now things don't have to bow to tornadoes and earthquakes. Now things bow to the name of Jesus. It wasn't anything that, typically takes that out. We'll talk about that more in detail. But I do want you to see that now creation and everything responds to Jesus Christ and the authority that He's going to have. And it goes on to say that authority that the Creator who came flesh has is really the glory of the Father. The ingredients of divine providence is Christ plus the glory of God equal fatherhood. Now this is where we're going to end and where the Bible really shifts. Much of the Old Testament, if not all of it, had its zero concept that God was a father. God was a creator. God was the God of other gods. God was the God of Abraham. God was the God of Isaac and Jacob. God was the God of Israel. And their God fought all the other gods. But He was very much our God. He's our dude. He's the guy that fights. He beats Baal. He beats Molech. He's the God of Elijah. And they had names for Him. He was Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Sikkenu, Jehovah Imkadesh, Jehovah Shalom. He had all these names that as humans interacted with Him, they gave Him all these names. But the one thing that was so different is we really never understand that this seemingly brutal Creator that has all these things that seem so crude and rude to humans, over here, the Son of God shows up and goes, well, let me just kind of tell you, He's a Father. And so the concept of Father for you and me is simple. Pray this, our Father who art in heaven. And you're like, that's a prayer. Can you imagine being a Jew and having some carpenter stand up and say that the God that has been the God of Moses and killed Pharaoh and all of that, you stand up and go, well, when you talk to Him, you just need to call Him our Father. It's such a foreign concept. How could He be a father? And then Jesus Himself, this is interesting, Jesus Himself will say of this God that we've deemed so bad in the Old Testament. He does awful things. Babies are dying and everything that seemingly is the will of God. Jesus, who is God in the flesh, says, really, there's just nobody good but Him. Like He takes us back to the tree. You humans are trying to call Him good and evil. I'm just letting you know He is the essence of good. So, and again, how? How could He be the essence of good? If He's the essence of good, how could He let all those people die? If He's the essence of good, why did He tell Joshua to kill all the people of Jericho and Ai? And He seems such a bad God. If He's so good, why did Moses not get in? And Jesus steps up and says, well, now He's a Father, and He's always working that which is good, and He alone is good, and there is no other good but Him. Can you imagine now how much we've skewed the story when God steps in and says, look, I'm life, I've given you life, there's my tree, there's my tree. Now that's a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Stay away from that. You don't need to know what's good and evil. I got all that covered. And then we eat of that tree, and now we're the ones that juggle good and evil. And Jesus comes in and kind of resets it and goes, no, He's just good. So therefore, that means when Jesus says that, He's telling me I have to let my wisdom go. I'll have to do that. Well, here's the ingredients. Christ is the wisdom and power and mercy of God. The glory of God is His justice, His punishment, and His goodness. And His fatherhood is you've been chosen, adopted, and goodness. Christ is the wisdom, power, and mercy of God. The glory of God is the justice, punishment, and righteousness of God. And His fatherhood is that you've been chosen, adopted, and He's good. Now that I call the ingredients of divine providence. The ingredients are Christ. The ingredients are the glory of God, ultimately leading that you will know Him as a Father. And the ingredients are wisdom, power, and mercy is Jesus. Justice, punishment, and righteousness is His glory meted out. And then His fatherhood is that He has chosen you. Let's end here. Revelation 3:14. This is where we're going to be going in the next part of our series after we end next week. Write this letter, Revelation 3:14, to the angel of the church in Laodicea. This is the message from the one who is the Amen, He's the faithful and the true witness, and He is the beginning of a new creation. Now, in this phrase, this is powerful. He said, well, here's the thing. I know we've been dealing with creation and the way God manages animals and fires and waters and tornadoes and all of that, but here's the true message. The message is coming from the one who's the Amen. In other words, I'm the so be it, it is what it is. He said, first off, I'm faithful and a true witness, because this phrase is how God is going to use His providence moving forward. I'm the faithful and true witness, and I'm the beginning of a new creation. Now, my thinking is the moment this phrase is made, faithful and true witness of a new creation, I have to realize that I need to be very careful that I try to define God's providence in an Old Testament manner rather than from a new creation manner. If everything is the beginning of a new creation, that means there may be a new way of His providence working now that He never worked before. My question would be this. Just think this through. We'll talk about it in depth in round 2. Why would God need to use a tornado today? Or an earthquake? Because the last thing I saw is He doesn't need a tornado because He told you to go witness. He doesn't need to cause a firestorm because you're now His voice. He doesn't need to use a hurricane because you now carry His wisdom. So now the harshness is, as the world is in chaos, are we going to be used by the providence of God? I'm good He uses a donkey. I'm good when He uses a fish or a bird or a whale, or He turns water into wine. But when you stand up and you tell somebody that's kind of an introvert, that doesn't really like people, that has a bunch of emotional issues, you do know that the providence of God has chosen you as His creation, and you're not a rogue creation. You're not an undisciplined creation. You are a new creation, and what I'm going to do is empower you to be a witness, and you will go in all power and all authority anywhere in the world, and don't worry about hurricanes. You are going to turn the world upside down. You will be the display of my glory. I don't need a lightning storm to display my glory. You are my glory on display. And then I say, I just had a bad day. I don't like people. I can't do it. It's so hard down here. Right? And so the question becomes, it's pretty sad when God can use a raven in the Old Testament better than He can use His own son and daughter. Or He can use a whale better than He can use me because I'm so distracted, I'm so busy, I'm so irritated, I'm so hurt, I'm so mad, I'm so disappointed, I can't figure Him out. And the whole point of Sovereign Faith Part 2 is to take you out of thinking how God uses creation and how does God use the new creation. Not what He could do with a donkey, what can He do with me? Not what He can do to flood the earth. What can He do with me? What would happen if all of us became a river of living water? We would flood the earth with His glory. But it's so much better to talk about Him flooding it with water versus me carrying the living water with me. Well, what do you think about God using fires in California? Okay, great if you want to go there, but come back a little bit. Come back just a little bit more. Why do you think a tongue of fire sat down on your head? Because He doesn't need to burn California with fire. He has baptized you with fire. You are the display of His glory. You carry living water, which is the judgment of God. You carry the fire of God with you. You have all authority to speak to creation. And yet we love the stories of the Old Testament while we talk about how broken we are and we're victims and so Sovereign Faith Part 2 is going to spank a little bit. It's going to really kind of touch us like, what is this new creation? What is this new level of His authority? What is this new level of His sovereignty? So again, I will challenge all of us reading the book. There is the Old Testament providence of God, and He never changes. So the justice and the mercy and the obedience and all the things that creation did has now been meted out in Jesus, and He's like, okay, we're going to start over. It's all brand new now. I don't need to use rain. I need to use you. I don't need to use a tornado. I need you to go into town and stir things up. I need you to be my voice and my light and my hope and my glory and my wisdom. And as I said last week, in OPS, I will baptize you with a power. I will give you gifts. I will anoint you. I will speak through you. I will give you discernment. You won't even be able to fathom. Greater is He that's in you than he that's in the world. And so the providence of God for the New Testament is that you are the new creation and He's wanting to work with you. And you have the ability to shift the environment you live in and the world you live in if we would but become a display of creation. So, Father, here's the thought. Let me give you this and I'll pray. This is where we're going. Next week we'll land the plane, and this is where we're going in part 2. If you want to sign up, I'd love you to do it. The divine providence of God manifest in a new way in the resurrection of Christ. I'm not saying you don't see some strange stories in the New Testament, but they're sure different than the Old Testament stories. Because we're doing life in a new way with a new system, and the providence of God is manifesting differently now that Christ has been punished, Christ has paid the obedience, Christ has meted out the justice, Christ has humbled the human heart, Christ has paid the ultimate price, Christ has made me right with God, Christ has brought me back to the wisdom of God, Christ is the only way for it to work, and all of that glory and wisdom comes on the inside of me, and God goes, all right, let's get busy. We're going to go change the world. So, Father, thank you so much for just let what we've taught tonight sink down deep in our heart, and let us just grow from it, and let us learn from it. And my prayer is that when we think providence, we don't think what is God doing with a tornado against a trailer, but what is He doing in me? And we don't think what is God doing with fires in Myrtle Beach? What is God doing with floods in North Carolina? But we start asking when we talk providence, what is God doing in me? Am I making a difference where I live? Father, I thank you for that.